The Dr. Oba Tashaka Show. Free your mind, and the rest will follow. A show for all who are on the journey to discover the truths about their identity, history, culture, politics, spirituality, and family relationships. This is a show for the Black Freedom Movement and the Black Power generation and the hip-hop generation, including Black Lives Matter and associate activists, all of whom are seeking change. Dr. Oba Tashaka and his guests are dropping knowledge and insight from his successful organizing, research, writings, and innovative thoughts, the best of which have piped into God's mind to lift you up higher and higher. To the bosses, OGs, rappers, influencers, and those looking to evolve from the constraints of misinformation and miseducation to build a foundation for personal growth, love, and mental freedom. Check out the wisdom of the OR. Yeah, that's the original revolutionary, Oba T, who inspired 1 million black men with his rousing speech at the Million Man March, and who continues to fight, write, and speak the truth. Dr. Oba Tashaka is one of the deepest deep thinkers in the world today. A quote by Dr. Asa Hilliard. Dr. Oba Tashaka, then Bill Bradley, was the best leader organizer in the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE. An endorsement from Dr. George Wiley, Associate Director of National CORE and the best organizer blacks produced in the 1970s as the organizer of the National Welfare Rights Organization. The Dr. Oba Tashaka Show. Free your mind, and the rest will follow.
Greetings to the family here, to Strutting Lady Soul, a.k.a. Cosmic Upload. That's a heck of a name. Right on there, Lady Soul. Brother Ogawa, the hardest working man on YouTube and Facebook and Twitter. Been working his butt off for this show. Sister Robin, one of our most loyal, dedicated listeners and a very conscious sister. I hope someday we get a chance to meet sometime, since we're in the same area, the Bay Area. Too Loud to Zoo, one of our most conscious listeners and a person who helps us with these live streams and other things. A brother who knew Professor John Henry Clark. So this is going to be part 2 of what we covered last week. And I hope that you get a lot out of it. I really enjoyed the comments, both questions and comments made by the viewers of last week's show. In fact, I have to admit, it's the only time that I came close to being worn out. You can't wear me out. And I think it was just the depth of the questions and comments, which I really enjoyed. And welcome to Brother Gregory Jones. Looks like a fellow warrior scholar there. So one of the things that I found interesting was the fact that a lot of you are versed on international economics and how they affect Africa and the African world. And so a number were making comments about the International Monetary Fund and World Bank, since last week's show focused on how those institutions were set up to promote American global rule. Um, for those of you that don't know about these institutions, you need to do your homework because they're very important. Shai Kwe Arma. I wonder if this is the Arma. Whether you are or not, greetings. Brother Arma is one of our great scholars, intellectuals. He translated Dr. Obenga's, I think, probably greatest book up to now, Philosophy During the Pharaonic Period. I actually got to see him deliver to Obenga at least a draft version, showing it to him on the computer at the African World Scholars Conference in 2004. Same thing with Shahid Douglas, welcome, and Moses Ayo, greetings. So you need to know these institutions, not only to know what they're doing when it comes to Africa, but the policies they're practicing in Africa that they have worked out in places like Chile and Indonesia, they're running on you. And they cause impoverishment in Black communities. So what's called neoliberalism, just as you need to know about the IMF, International Monetary Fund, and World Bank, you need to know what neoliberalism is. We think it's sufficient to just put it all under white people. But the question is, it ain't white people running stuff. It's the rulers of white people. And you need to know how their systems work. I had to learn that. That's why I led a victorious movement, the only victorious one in the North, between 63 and now. I learned that I was ignorant in the beginning of the battle in 63. I explained to people before, I underwent an awakening. And one of the things that led me to do is, of course, study my people and study my enemy. And you don't have a lifetime, because I've never lost a battle and I fought a whole lot of them, led a whole lot of them. You might win one by accident or by luck, or you might hit upon something that works. But if you consistently win, it's because you know yourself and know your enemy. There is still no guarantee of victory. In every battle, you better be humble. Otherwise, that's the one where your clock gets clean. For you that don't know what that means, you get whipped. Sister Coco, who asked some of the deepest questions last week, and she says, revolutionary greetings. Right on. From one revolutionary to the other. I really enjoyed your comments last week. So we need to understand the systems that oppress us, if we're going to get out from under them. Don't just put them under the generic name of a color. White. Yeah, okay. But last week we went into Aryanism to show you that that is certainly part of it. And there was a whole making of Europeans into white people that I don't have time to go into here. But last week was focusing on the root of them, European and Euro-Americans, which is Aryanism. And then all the isms that flow out of that. And they all pretty much operate on the same principles, capitalism and others. And you'd be surprised how many other systems that you think are progressive, when the European is operating them, ultimately they're coming under Aryanism too. 5-star review quotes Sun Tzu, who says, if you know your enemy and yourself, you will win every battle. That is Black folks' problem. We do not know our conqueror. All we know is his job. Well, some of us do know our conquerors. But yes, I would say the biggest weakness for Blacks is we know racism, but we don't know the roots of that, particularly in Aryanism. But Aryanism precedes racism. But more important, we don't know their worldview. And if you're a Marxist, you need to understand that Marx didn't know Africa. And what he knew about Native Americans, he got from Morgan through Ingalls, who studied the Iroquois Confederacy. And so Marx was deficient, and I'm not anti-Marxist. I want to stress this. Anyone that wants to overthrow this system, go right ahead. I'm not standing in your way because it is a part of the Western system to create an anti-leftist position as a cover for doing you in. And then they'll come in and label you as the enemy, even if you're not aligned with that. But I'm not opposed to anyone that wants to change the system from oppressive to non-oppressive. But if you are locked into a system that is founded on a European worldview, which Marx was, because he didn't question the fundamentals of the worldview, he questioned the fundamentals of capitalism. And so he's excellent on that, especially industrial capitalism. I read almost all his stuff, you know what I mean? And like King said, I find it to be basically correct, though he missed the point. He missed the point of understanding how central the accumulation of capital through slavery was to the Industrial Revolution. His focus on surplus value and stuff like that didn't focus heavily on the profits gained from the free labor of Africans who also faced genocide as well as enslavement in certain parts of Africa. So I'm not putting down Marx. I'm simply saying that if you're coming from the same worldview, even though you want to modify it for improvement, and in this case, Marx wanted to modify it to equitably distribute the wealth, and that's why I'm not opposed to him. That's good. But he didn't have no environmental imperative because he hadn't studied African communalism, where the land, earth, air, and water was passed on from generation to generation without anybody owning it, everybody sharing it, and leaving it in better condition than they received it. So, and the environmental imperative was central because it came out of an African worldview. So I'm just simply saying that study other systems, but draw especially on your own. You know what I mean? Draw on your own. Because what they put forward so far ain't worked. You hear me? So before getting into today's show, one of the things that I wanted to do was to do a shout out to the sisters, especially, and the brothers, but especially the sisters in Georgia for the victory that they achieved in electing Reverend Warnock to the United States Senate. See, I'm revolutionary. But I remember something that most revolutionaries have forgot, because what happens when they become revolutionaries, they become so advanced that they forget how they got transformed. Reform is a mother of revolution. Now, reform ain't going to lead to revolution, and some reformers stay there. But generally, the way you wake up is it's just like walking. You got to crawl before you walk. And because transformation of a society is long term, you have to have some things that people get that improve their lives in the meantime. You just can't operate on the misery principle. You know what I mean? So my greatest achievement in organizing came through the San Francisco Freedom Movement. He said it was a reformist movement. Yeah, it got jobs for Black people and people of color. And what's the main reason the Black family is at 29% two-parent household? They ain't the jobs out there to feed 2 mouths or 3 in a family. And if there are, 2 low-paying jobs don't usually match up to something that will support a family. So there's a direct relationship between economic impoverishment of Blacks in the post-68 period and the weakening of the Black family. We'll go into that in the next show. So the Black freedom movement that I was proud to lead is the only successful Black power, Black freedom movement from 63 to now because we addressed the urban realities of economics. We defeated an entire economic power structure and we didn't take a dime. It was all for our people. And I mean, all the major corporate industries, we kicked their behind. That was done nowhere else. And so you could call that a reform. But guess what? That beats not eating. Huh? So I'm most proud of that because I've been involved in a lot of movements, but this was the most important for me. So when congratulating the sisters especially who did the door knock without very much, if any, money from the Democratic Party, they are the ones that really won this victory, along with the brothers that did it with them and their allies. And that door knock enabled Reverend Warnock to win by 80,000 votes. Now, that's a shame. In that, while this is a victory, they were going up against a mummy, a dummy. Yet, I have to say, and I knew that this wasn't as dumb a choice as people think it was. I knew this was a dangerous choice because of the celebrity of this football player that he put up there. I knew Black people wouldn't fall for this. See, again, we underestimate the consciousness of Black folks. Only 2 or 3% of Black people gave him anything. The rest of them were embarrassed by his presence. A person who's up here talking nonsense. A person whose life contradicted everything he stood for. But you also know whites were consistently behind him, but not enough to win. See, it's another thing we don't know. White people split. See, the Afrocentrists think they know white people because it's all white people, white people. White supremacy, white supremacy. You know, I don't use that term anymore. And you'll see really why in this analysis today, they're in decline. You're empowering them with that term. They invented it anyway. And then that's your whole analysis. White supremacy. But the reality is if Warnock won by only 80,000 votes, it means that he had to fritter off some other votes. Some people that voted for the Republican governor who stole the election from Stacey Abrams voted for Warnock. Some whites in the suburbs voted for Warnock because a third of the Democratic Party base is white. Whites are split. Remember the American War of Revolution. 1/3 for it, 1/3 against it, 1/3 neutral. There's a lot of ways to interpret that data. But the main one is they ain't all together on anything. And that's their history. That's also a part of Aryanism. It's very hard to get your whole people behind something when your system is based on doing you in. So enough of them have enough sense to at least see that. But the key point is, it was this door knocking, it was this politicizing, led by sisters and then brothers assisted, that had to go out and explain the new laws that were restricting the Black vote, that had to explain how people could do early voting and fight in spite of the fact that they couldn't find a mailbox to put their votes in, that had to explain to people how if they needed water when they were on the line, they would have a party right across the street. So they could shake their booty, get them a sandwich and something to drink, and then go back and vote, And I'm not a great practitioner of electoral politics. My main thing's the street, but it's one form. It is not the primary form, but it's important. So the fact that it took a former president, Barack Obama, to come out 2 times and campaign, and it took all other kinds of celebrities and everything else and a huge amount of money to just chalk up an 80,000 person victory says something. One thing it says is that don't underestimate your enemy. But the other thing that it says is when you go messing with black people, we get mad. Black people got mad. They saw what was happening. They got mad. Stacey Abrams gave in on the issue of voter ID because her polling showed that 80% of the people supported voter ID. These new voter ID laws are designed to disenfranchise blacks and young people. Those 80% that supported it were white, almost all. It's a shame that she went along with that because what she was doing is listening to the advisors who were giving her the middle of the road advice, take the middle of the road, because she was hoping that if she had a chance to beat Kemp, who stole the last election from her, then what she would have to be able to do is appeal to independents and some moderate whites. That didn't work, you know. So this really speaks to the strength of race consciousness because 98% of blacks voted for Warnock. And you don't win unless you have that kind of support. That's the strength of black people. We got a culture, baby. And when this culture is riled up and angered, we make things change. So that's important. And right now, the Democrats have a little leeway until the House shifts to the Republicans to push through some stuff. And if they don't push through the John Lewis voter rights law, then they deserve to stick their heads in the garbage can or the toilet and flush it. Because that was on the bottom of Biden's agenda before when he was pushing for his infrastructure and everything else. It better go to the top because through federal legislation, you can put down some of this restriction on black voting and youth voting and Latino voting, but especially black voting. This is the second post-Reconstruction, and they're trying to play the same card that they played in the first one. The first one, they completely stripped blacks of the vote. In the second one, they're trying to do as much as possible. And right now, the Supreme Court is considering a case where it is being proposed that states have the final say on voting. If that happens, then you're going to see some real hell cut loose. Real hell. So again, these Democrats better get up off their behind and use this limited time to push that through. They should also get guaranteed minimum income. It should be around $30 an hour. $15 an hour gets you barely $30,000 a year. You can't even pay for rent on that in many places. So that's an opening. Christopher Sample said, I think it shows how little people think actual qualifications aren't necessary to perform senatorial duties. Even conservatives had to know Walker was an order of fries short of a happy meal. Well, most people don't think you can be this dumb and serve in the Senate. It's just that when it comes to black people, a whole lot of white people will go along with that. They generally won't go along with it if they know that the white people are that down in the dumps, unless they wave the flag of racism. Then white people get real dumb. So yeah, there's a point to that. Okay, now let's get into today's show. Last week's topic was Aryanism, the philosophy that inspires United States imperialism. I hope you get the point that this show is dealing with some stuff that not too many shows are covering. give it some support. One, subscribe. Two, provide some financial support. That stuff I did with Garvey, I brought in a cinematographer. And I noticed some people didn't have as much interest in that as some of the other shows I have. I mean, I got Garvey's son, one of the most advanced thinkers on the planet. We've hooked up. We're going to be teaming up. This brother's sharp. You know what I mean? And so I brought in a filmmaker to put background on stuff. That cost me money. So show a little honey. So last week's topic was Aryanism, the philosophy that inspires United States imperialism. This week's topic is part 2 of that. The topic is Aryanism, the philosophy that inspired the decline of the West and U.S. imperialism. And we have here on this leaflet here the picture of a 4-star. There's only one black 4-star in the U.S. Marine Corps. This guy is it. In the whole history of the Marine Corps, they've only come up with one. In my brainwash days, I was in the Marine Reserves. I was the best one in my unit. And I reached the great rank of private first class. But of course, this is when my mind wasn't first class, because when I cashiered out of the Marine Reserves, 1963, I stepped in as chair of San Francisco Corps. And so that freed me of any chance of being drafted or anything. But I was in the Marine Corps because I'd been brainwashed. But by the time I was ready to leave, my company commander, whose name was Pete McCloskey, I mentioned it to some people, some haven't heard this. He was a captain in the Marine Corps. He later became the person who gave Johnny Cochran, Geronimo Pratt's lawyer, the information that freed him from prison. You know, so he brought me into his office one day. Captain McCloskey, who became a moderate Republican in the Bay Area. And he said, Bill, my name was Bill Bradley then, you're a real good Marine. I'd like to put you through officer training school. Now, I've been in the ROTC, Lieutenant Colonel. I was the best in my unit, won the award for best cadet. I've always strived to be the best in everything I do. I was the best Negro. Huh? I said to myself, hell no. By then, I got to where my father was. And some of you are new, so I'm going to repeat some stuff my father said later on. Now, I know my father looked at me funny when I had these uniforms on. This Marine Corps general you got right here, who's a 4-star, was at one point in charge of the U.S. Africa Command. You know? So that's a part of the expression of U.S. imperialism, and that they would put a military system up in Africa. You know what I mean? Not too smart. Not too smart. So this week's topic, Aryanism, the philosophy that inspired the decline of Western United States imperialism. So you might ask, how is it that Aryanism could inspire the rise of the West and the U.S., and at the same time its fall? Well, don't forget the central principles of Aryanism covered last week. Lord and Master syndrome. Arius, Lord and Master. Aryan, the masses of Aryans who are used to do the dirty work, who are viewed by the Arius, the lords and masters in the beginning, who were nomads and warriors. Now they're capitalists, whatever form that might be, industrial, but more likely technotronic, computer, otherwise, and now investment capitalists, because the investment capitalists are the ones who are, doing the main stuff, because capitalism is not producing anything, productively. America can't produce a good car anymore. About the only thing they can sell now is trucks. So The operative principles of Aryanism is Lord and Masterism, and that is particularly the Aryos, who are the masters of those who they use for their dirty work, who they regard as no good for nothing, dirty scum. And they're the ones who do the dirty work for the system. And then you see them out on the street corner begging with one leg, or their brains are scattered. And this happens to blacks too, post-traumatic syndrome, based on the dreams, the nightmares they're having, and everything else because of the dirt that they did for the system, and the system discards them. So how could Aryanism that promotes rise promote fall? Because the very thing, and note here a basic rule, wherever your greatest strength is, there lies your greatest weakness. Know that. That's for everybody. Know that, And so the basis for the rise of the West and the rise of the U.S. was conquest. But that was driven by this drive to master and control and dominate. Well, it's that same drive that has brought them down. You hear me? And we'll see how as we discover, look at this particular phase. But to be specific, when it comes to imperialism, and that was the topic of last week's show, its rise, the U.S. rose to be the hegemon or major world power in the world. And today the topic is its decline. That note, it is the essence of imperialism, that it is the last phase of all societies that go through it. Show me any society in history that is in the phase of imperialism, and I can show you, and some of you already know this, that they are in their last phase. They're in the death phase. Now, it could be a long time. They could be running things on a global level for a long time, or it could be a short time. But this is the beginning of the end, because when you reach the apex of anything, there's only one way to go, and that's down. You hear me? And then there's other things about imperialism. Imperialism is a stage where in some societies that may have been spiritual, they fall into a materialistic mentality. Kemet. When Kemet reaches the 18th dynasty, and they had been invaded by the Hyksos, threw them out by the 18th, the end of the 17th dynasty and the 18th. They only ruled northeastern Kemet. But what happens is, as Sheikh Anta Diop says, Kemet decides to go to the stage of a defensive imperialism. And so what they do is begin to carry out attacks against the areas, particularly Palestine, where the Hyksos, Hyksos, shepherd kings came from. They did not set up colonies there. They didn't do that. But they carried those attacks out. And what you see is there's an increasing secularization of Kemetic philosophy arising during this period. That's a materialization of things. Kemet came out of a spirit-based culture that had certainly a material reality, but spirit dominated, high values dominated. And what you're seeing now in this 18th dynasty on, as Kemet faces wave after wave of invaders, and Kemet is defending itself and also carrying attacks to the outside, while you have on the one hand Akhenaten, who's trying to clean things up and have a moral revolution. He's gone so far, he's forgetting the defenses of his country. But then those that come later, they are becoming more secular. Not completely, but more secular. And certain practices coming from the Hyksos, from the Asians, are seeping in to Kemetic culture. So this is the nature of imperialism. And those of us that are insecure when it comes to power, we always like to identify with the high period of power. So a lot of Blacks identify with the 18th dynasty as the greatest dynasty. I don't. Pre-dynastic or ancient Kemet, that's the greatest set of dynasties. They created all the Kemetic civilization other than the pyramids. You know, Kemet was in decline in the first dynasty. That's what all historians say, because they rest on a civilization that had been built from 10,000 BC on up to 3,300 BC. Yet it's this period of history that's ignored. Watch my shows that I did on the Twa. That's the foundation of Kemetic civilization, but more important, of world civilization. And then look at the series done on the Anu. These are agrarian Twa, who were the founders of the dynastic system of Kemet. As I pointed out before, Asar was Anu, one of these little guys. You know what I mean? So imperialism is the last stage of all great societies. That is, when I say great, I mean great power. When you reach this point of power, then it's the beginning of the end. How long you're going to exercise that power depends. We don't know. You know, it depends on a lot on how many mistakes the people in power make. It also depends on what the world is doing to you. You know what I mean? It depends on a whole lot of different stuff. Part 3 next week will address how the decline of the U.S. Affects African people globally, Africans in the U.S., and the society at large, and how do we deal with it. Now, today's show will address the decline of the American empire. Another thing about some of our people, they're so wrapped up in trauma. And I'm not playing with that. I know we have been traumatized. But some of us don't realize that there are changing world conditions. And what makes some people sad should make others glad, to paraphrase Malcolm X. And when somebody's got their foot on your neck, the fact that there are things happening globally as well as nationally that kind of knocks those who've got their foot on your neck off of balance, that's not such a bad thing. But you need to understand why. But to do that, you got to think beyond the area. So normally when people are dealing with imperialism in the United States, before getting into its decline, I want to focus briefly on its rise. Imperialism in the United States, usually, according to the story, starts around 1898 with the U.S. taking over the Philippines and moving on Cuba, moving on Puerto Rico, and then later Hawaii. It should be noted that the British encouraged this because they wanted their kith and kin, their children, to get used to the bloodlust of imperialism. And they gave the go-ahead on this on a condition. The condition was that the Americans support them as opposed to the Germans. Americans were fine with that. And so what ends up happening is Britain ends up supporting this American drive because America is just taking the scraps from Spain. These are Spanish colonies, and Britain's not interested in them. So they figure that if they get their kith and kin involved in that, they might get them involved in some other British imperial enterprises. But it's incorrect to locate American imperialism with these early conquests. I'm going to ask people up here to see if they can give me an answer. Why is it that it's incorrect to start American imperialism with America taking over the Philippines and these other Spanish possessions, Puerto Rico and whatnot? Can anybody put up a reason why this is a false analysis? Can anybody just put on the screen there their opinion of why it's false to start imperialism with America gobbling up the Spanish empires? Can anybody do that? I'm going to give you a second to see if somebody can put something up there. Anybody? I'm waiting. All these sharp people here. Okay. Yes, there you go. Tie 313. Good answer. Because America was a colony. Exactly. Because the British, who were the primary invaders, the Dutch, the French, the Spanish, they had all come in here to take the country from its native inhabitants. So America was a colony from the beginning. It was an imperialist operation from the beginning. And it was a domestic colony. And it became a successful one because of genocide, because of the successful effort of the people who came here, the whites, to wipe out 90% of the Native American population, which is generally ignored. And then, as someone just noted, to seize nearly half of Mexico, bring us in as the enslaved. And then the people whose land they're stealing, then they call them aliens, both those who are living here and those who come across the border. And why they come across, that's a whole nother discussion. But the point is, America was an imperialist power from the beginning. And so if your founding is based on genocide, then enslavement and land theft, then when you stretch out into the outer world, it's going to be real bloody, because there's a savagery and barbarism that's inherent in how your country was set up. It was Toynbee who said that America is the only society that went from savagery to barbarism without experiencing one day of civilization. And you can match that with the fact that almost every year of this country has been engaged in war, almost every year. So this is the nature of that. And I see Ty 13. He is talking about Australia. Yeah, the extermination of the Aborigines and the Tasmanians. Same thing. In fact, it should be noted that the Imperial project carried out by the West was a genocidal project because it was carried out against people of color. And so you had the erasure of all Native American people of the Caribbean, the Caribs, the Araks, wiped them out, and then turn around and have the nerve to define themselves as civilization, and then to try and wipe you out, and then you running around, not you that are watching the show, running around talking about how we were dehumanized in slavery. Oh, like hell. Just because you're in the mud doesn't make you mud. You might be muddy, but that don't make you mud. It was the people who imposed those savage conditions on us who were the savages, because we came out with our humanity intact. I understand this film that Will Smith has done is pretty good. People should check it out, because I haven't seen it yet, but that he picked this scarred African and took him through his life. I haven't seen it, but I read Dr. Raymond Winbush's review, and I'm going to watch it, that apparently he captured the essence of enslavement. It was resistance. It was resistance. That's why the mantra of the spiritual blues was, before I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave, go home to my Lord and be free. That was the mantra, by the way, of the Black Freedom Movement as well. And that was the mantra of the spiritual blues, the high point of New African culture, the foundation of the art form. It was resistance. And if you're oppressed, there's just one question. What are you doing to resist that oppression? So when we talk about the decline of the West and the U.S., we need to start with what its rise was based on. And start with the fact that before America becomes a world power, it's a genocidal, domestic colonial power. That doesn't mean we are oppressed under domestic colonialism. Native Americans are. We're under semi-colonialism. It's a little different because they brought us from somewhere else, brought us here, and then we face this oppression here. That's a little different. And it's important to make that distinction because it has to do with outcomes later. Because if you're a straight up colony, then all you have to do is push for your liberation, and sooner or later, that means you're running the society you're in. A lot of reasons why that isn't true. And of course, for Native Americans, you could say that's not true, but it is true for the areas in which they live. And you could say that could be true for us, but we don't all live in one area. There's a lack of contiguous land base for us that is normally a part of what you would call colonialism, domestic or other. But that's another question. So, so if we are to contextualize the rise of Aryan or European power in the 18th and 19th century, then I have no time to go into that now, but it begins with the fall of Moorish power in Spain. 711 AD. And from that to 1491, the Moors and the Arabs ran Spain. But when that rule is ended, then you see the Portuguese, among others, beginning to move into Africa in their exploration period. This is the beginning of Western imperialism in Africa. And I'm not going through all of this today. And then in their internal struggles that the Europeans have, by the time that they began to carve up Africa in the Berlin Conference, Britain had been the global hegemon or global ruler for almost 300 years. And this had come through sea power. And it had come through some very good British admirals and luck, because a lot of it had to do with luck. But by the time they moved on Africa, along with the French, the Dutch, the Germans, others, they had largely settled the conflicts between them so that they could focus on Africa. So this is a brief thing. You need to study this period. So the rise, if we're going to talk about the fall of American power, we need to be clear about the basis for its rise, because it's got a lot to do with its fall. And the fall of Western power, which it has fallen. The rise of Western power, Aryan power, in the modern period, 19th, 20th century, was based heavily on techniques coming out of the Industrial Revolution. The particular technique that enabled the rise of Europe and the U.S. was gunpowder, specifically the Gatling gun. but it was also naval power. And then later, with World War II, air power. But the key thing about air power is you can't win a war in the air. So if your power is based on air power, you better be able to convert it with troops on the ground. You better be able to knock down victories on the ground. And if you don't, the air power will tear things up on the ground. But we have some historic lessons that we'll get into later that prove that that won't give you the victory. So the basis of the rise of Aryan power had to do with the possession of techniques in the hands of the West. Techniques they didn't invent. Gunpowder, they didn't invent. It was invented in China. And Africans had used it. They had used it for religious celebrations in Kemet. And the Moors had used firing sticks in Spain. And while the Chinese developed gunpowder, and they had developed cannon power, which indicates advanced gunpowder, they didn't integrate it into their military, meaning they didn't make it the central component of warfare. Why? Because they didn't have to. At that point, you didn't have anybody else that had it. And then China made the mistake of shutting itself off from the world and not keeping up with what the world was doing. And at that point, as particularly the West begins to use these techniques and particularly go through an industrial revolution, then it changes power relations in the world. So the rise of Western power was centered largely on the fact that in the beginning, the West had the exclusive possession of industrial power, and out of it, gunpowder and gun power. They had the exclusive possession of that. While the Chinese knew gunpowder, they had not developed the industrial system nor made it general among their military, and they were in decline as a power ruled by emperors. That was undergoing change. So the rise of the West has got to do with this, the possession of techniques exclusively in the hands of white people, of Aryans. And then with that, there is the whole brainwashing that occurs and everything else with the missionary enterprise and other things. And so there's a new elite that emerges in Africa, for example, that has been Western trained. And there's a shift in their mentality from the traditional mentality of the African. And so this is key. Now, while Africans and people of color scored victories, and this is a key thing to understand, against the military attacks against Africa, these victories are extremely important to understand. The victory of Menelik at the Battle of Adowa, Adowa, where he defeated the British, and before that, the Italians, or defeated the British first and the Italians second. The victory of the Zulus at the Battle of Islandoa under the Zulu king Setwayo. Islandoa is a significant military victory because the fighting forces of the Zulus, who had the greatest discipline going militarily on the planet, set up by Shaka, Zulu warriors could travel for miles barefoot. They didn't wear shoes because it slowed them down, and engage an enemy in battle. And they used an asigi, which was a short stabbing spear. So whereas most warfare in Africa had been throwing a spear and most people not getting stabbed or killed, Shaka introduced something that's a killing enterprise. But that Zulu discipline was key. And so Cetewayo uses that. And at the Battle of Islandua, he's able to break the British square. Now, this is a big achievement because the British square, at that time, the British had single firing rifles. So they'd have a square of maybe 7 lines, one right behind the other. And so one would shoot, reload, then the second would shoot, and then the third, while each one was reloading. So to break that square meant that you were going under continuous fire, and the Zulus defeated the British at the Battle of Islandua. Big thing, big victory. And then they have the victories of the battles of Ntombe and Hulambani, again under Cetewayo. Big victories because of the way in which the Zulus organized. They also had great military victories against the West in the Sudan through the Mahdi, M-A-H-D-I, who sliced off the head of Chinese Gordon, who had been a drug dealer in the Opium War in China. The Mahdi did not want him killed. The people said, hey, we want his head. So this was a great victory. And then you had 100 years of resistance to Western imperialism in Africa. So it was not, oh, they just came in and took it. You hear me? It wasn't that. You know what I mean? So key to these victories was the culture of Africa, a noble culture. It was a great warrior code of Africa. Africans produced the greatest warriors on the planet. We're the only warriors whose code is fearlessness. Every other people mass fear. The African warrior in traditional times knew no fear. That's my code. I only had one fear, and that was the consequences of my own wrongdoing. That's the thing that comes out of the Kemetic system of the final judgment, that I might do something to endanger my soul and be sent to hell. I didn't have a great fear of that. I hadn't done anything. But I got over that one because I figured out if I did do something that, condemn my soul to that, well, nothing I can do about it. But there is something that I can do to prevent it. But other than that, I don't have fear. And fearlessness is a natural condition. And as I pointed out in some shows on spirituality, fear is the greatest obstacle to spiritual growth. Fear is a myth. You're taught fear. You're not born with it. Religions teach it. The IRS teach it. The government teaches it. Every institution that wants to control you teaches that. And then you can really tell you're done in when you start saying, oh, without fear, I might have done this and I might have done that. I don't know how many guys I've worked out with who that was their philosophy. Oh, they're a better person because of fear, their fear of the consequences of something that led them not to do it. No, really? Maybe you didn't do it because you're just a good person. But you don't need fear to keep you in check against wrongdoing, So key to these victories was the culture of the Africans who resisted imperialism. But the problem with these victories is that these were armies going up against British and Western armies that had the techniques of gunpowder and especially the techniques of the Gatling gun that was continuous fire. That was the old machine gun. And these victories were achieved with second-rate technology, but first-rate courage. But first-rate courage ain't enough. You hear me? And so after 100 years, Africa would go under. That is, under imperialism. So what's the turning point that shifts this? And see, this is another thing. John Henry Clark used to stress this one. It's a big mistake when you study history just to confine yourself to African history. African history is big. That's your foundation. That's your groundation, as Africans in the Caribbean would say. So it's not no small thing. And it's so vast, you'll never know all of it. Just like African American culture is so complex, you'll never know all of it either. You know what I mean? One reason why we chalk up victories when we draw from both our ancient African culture, the strengths of African culture today, and New African or African Caribbean or whatever part of the world you come from. That's your strength. So you need to look at world history also. And African history is world history. But there are lessons that you can learn from what other people have done in history as well. So if the rise of Europe had to do with the exclusive possession of techniques coming out of the Industrial Revolution, then the fall of Europe is going to have to do with those techniques falling into other people's hands, other than Aryans, other than Europeans, other than Euro-Americans. So it was the Russo-Japanese War of February 9th, 1904, where the Japanese and Russians had been in negotiations. And the Russians did not want to make any concessions to the Japanese. The Japanese wanted the Russians to concede that they had certain spears, one of which was Korea. And in exchange for that, they were willing to recognize Russian authority in Manchuria, which is interesting because it wasn't their country. And the Russians said, hell no, big mistake, you know. But what the Japanese had behind them was that their leaders, who had been under a feudal system, a samurai system, made the decision to modernize. And this was called the Meiji Restoration, M-E-I-J-I, Meiji Restoration, where they sent their brightest young people to Europe to study industrialization and to bring those techniques back to Japan. They did that for a couple of reasons. One, to prevent the West from being able to invade it at another time. They could do it for a reason, that they had not been invaded by the West. And therefore, the West didn't have their hands on them. And they were fortunate enough to prevent an invasion from Genghis Khan. So they decided to carry out a industrial revolution, a modernization drive, heavily influenced by Japanese culture, but also with the intrusion of European cultural values. They begin to take on the value of the survival of the fittest, and assuming that anyone that hasn't undergone this process of industrialization deserves conquest. And that set China up and Southeast Asia up for ripe pickings. And this is them taking on the mentality, the imperialist mentality of those who they're competing against, the West. So when the Russians refused to compromise with the Japanese, February 9th, 1904, the Japanese launched a surprise naval attack. That's what you always do in war. Your stuff is by surprise. You don't go out and do like a lot of Negroes do, go on TV and announce what they're going to do. You don't do that. A lot of African independence leaders were telegraphing what they were doing. You don't do that. I don't do that. Right? And by the way, I was in the media a lot in the 60s, you know, but it was always diversion. Make it appear something's going to happen here and it's going to happen there. Or it was justification. It was building up a case for why we were going to do what we did, but not exactly explaining what it would be. Never giving away a strategy. I'm a strategist. That's my first passion. Other than love and God, strategy, baby. That's me. And so the Japanese carried out a surprise attack against the Russian Navy and in a short few minutes defeated them. A short few minutes. And after a while, a peace was worked out in which Teddy Roosevelt took part. And that was a signal in a peace treaty of the defeat of Russia. Now, this surprised the hell out of the West, because what it did is shift power in a region, in this case, Asia. Russia, as is Europe in general, is a part of Asia. It's a Euro-Asian nation with a heavy mix of Asians in their own population. And this was the beginning of the end of Russia as an imperial power for that period. And it brings on the 1905 revolution in Russia, softens them up for what would become the Russian Revolution during World War II, led by Lenin and Trotsky and others. So what did this signal? This signaled that if one power of color could gain the techniques others could and would, and sooner or later, the West possession of the techniques of war that made war just a simple exercise of going out and shooting people without them even getting close enough to deal any death blows, that sooner or later, that time was over. In studying the war in Vietnam, I studied Ho Chi Minh, looked at him. Great leader of the Vietnamese Revolution. As I pointed out in a previous show, he was heavily inspired by Marcus Garvey to go back to Vietnam and fight for the liberation of the Vietnamese people. He said one reason why he nosed up to the Russians was that he needed one white power to fight another white power. He needed the techniques of the West: guns, gunpowder, cannon, anti-aircraft artillery, and other munitions. And as we'll see, because of the unwise policies of the American government in the pursuit of their imperialist objectives, he got them. And then, of course, he also went to China, which had been natural enemies of the Vietnamese, and got support from the Chinese. And Ho Chi Minh was a Confucianist, because that area of Southeast Asia is influenced by Chinese culture. The written script of all these countries, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, is Chinese. They speak their own language, but the written script is Chinese. And Confucianism is a prevailing ideology. Ho Chi Minh was a person of noble character, cared only about his people. When he died, you could put all his possessions in a duffel bag. He was born on the same day as Malcolm X, May 19th. When he became president of North Vietnam, he lived in the servants' quarters. He didn't live in the presidential palace. And when America came back to upset the peace in Vietnam, he had him a pack, and in it was a typewriter, and went into the mountains, Ho Chi Minh. So the techniques that Ho Chi Minh could get from the Russians gave him the military equipment that his people needed to fight. And Ho Chi Minh knew America. And I said this once before. I was working out in the gym it's a couple of years ago, and it's a brother who had been in the Marines. He was a Marine major, and his family, some of them had been buffalo soldiers. And one of his ancestors met Ho Chi Minh in Africa. And they were standing together, and they were watching Frenchmen take pot shots at Africans. And Ho Chi Minh said that's what they do, because they did the same thing in Vietnam. They would take a boat out, and when they could see a Vietnamese, take a shot at them. Same stuff they tried to pull on us, So techniques had changed from just the exclusive hands of whites into the hands of people of color. Now, the other shift that would lead to the decline of the West and the decline of the U.S. is the shift in consciousness. The people of Africa and Asia, the people of Cuba in particular, in the Caribbean, would manifest a new consciousness. For Africans, this was manifested in the Fifth Pan-African Congress, the most important meeting that Africans had in the 20th century, where Malcolm Nurse, known then as George Padmore, a brother from Trinidad, convened the Fifth Pan-African Congress with the assistance of Kwame Nkrumah, who had spent 10 years being educated in the U.S. and inculcated with the values of Pan-Africanism. That Africans in the U.S., the idea of one Africa, a unified Africa, and one African people in a common struggle for liberation. And so the Fifth Pan-African Congress indicated a shift of consciousness where the elite of Africa, as well as the grassroots, because this Congress was made up heavily of trade unionists and other people. Jomo Kenyatta was president and others. This sense of transformation of consciousness was one of immediate independence, not of any reform waiting for changes before Africa could achieve its independence, as the previous Pan-African Congresses under Du Bois had been. And Du Bois was made honorary chair. And Amy Garvey's first wife, was present. And the ghost of Garvey was there, because the Garvey movement itself had been inspired by anti-war sentiments coming out of the post-World War I period, the anti-imperialist sentiments of African-American soldiers who had been used by their leaders, who had encouraged them to go fight to make the world safe for democracy. And they came back from World War I seeing that they were not safe from lynching. And so you had the emergence of what was called the new Negro, the fighting Black person, who was taking up armed self-defense against whites who had come back from fighting in World War I. And these Blacks were themselves ex-World War I veterans. And as I pointed out before, it was this anti-war sentiment that radicalized Garvey, because Garvey had come to the U.S. pro-war, supporting the King of England, who he loved. He professed a love for him in a letter he sent to him. It was the race consciousness of the African American and the anti-war consciousness that politicized Garvey and provided the militant base for the launching of the Universal Negro Improvement Association. So there was a shift of consciousness then. And then in the post-World War II period, there's a shift of consciousness among Blacks in this country that they're not putting up with segregation anymore. Blacks are coming back from World War II and they want changes. And it is this mentality that provides the basis for the Black freedom movement. And the transformations of consciousness in this mentality in both the South and the North that gives rise to the Black Power movement. And so, in the minds of many Black people in this country, in Africa, in the Caribbean, globally, and among people of color, there's a new mentality emerges where no longer are we centering our gaze on Europe or Euro-Americans. We're seeing beyond them. And as we used to say in the 60s, a white man's dead, meaning his mindset is dead. And this Aryan mentality is one that's going to have to be put to rest, because it's a danger to Aryans, the masses. It's a danger to humanity. It threatens the existence of the planet as a livable space, because not only has it led to waging war on humanity, but waging war on nature. Global warming is at the source of that. My book, Seba, goes into this. That philosophy has to change, not just a quick fix thing of cutting back on fossil fuels, which has to happen, but there's got to be a mental shift away from control and dominance to living in harmony with nature, living in harmony with humanity. That's going to take another kind of transformation. So the shift of consciousness was key. Prime Minister of England, Macmillan, traveling in Africa, at the end of World War II, he made the comment, the winds of change are blowing in Africa, meaning it's a new kind of African here. They're not taking this mess anymore. There's a reason why Britain ended up passing out independence. It wasn't because they were generous. They didn't have the power to hold on to those colonies anymore. What you learn from that might teach you something about what's going to happen for Africa down the road. So last week, I focused on World War II and how America emerged as the global world power, filling the global vacuum as a global leader of the world, not by vote, but by power, and how they set up institutions and stuff to run the world. And that was being planned during World War II. And understand, don't think this is mighty whitey just planning stuff, because until the Russians had shifted the balance of power with Germany, then all things were up for grabs. Germany had Europe. They could have wiped out the British Army, but Hitler had been indecisive. And when he finally made the move, 300,000 German soldiers, British soldiers, had been rescued. So a lot of outcomes in war. At the end, you can say, oh, yeah, this is the way it was. No, in the beginning, it could have gone either way. And so when America was doing all this planning for the post-World War II period, it was on ifs. If this happened, we can do this. If that happened, we can do that. But when it's clear that Britain's down the tube, Germany's defeated, America begins then to assume its position as a world power. Now, what happens is, at this point, America has two options. One is, at the end of World War II, they can do as they've done in every previous war, disarm. And they can use their vast industrial power to enrich its ruling elite and give enough crumbs to the masses of the people that they'd be satisfied. Because that's probably all they would do. But enough to feel that they had some prosperity. You know what I mean? They had that choice. And they were, of all the world's powers, great powers, the only one not damaged by World War II. So they had that choice, At the end of World War II, Russia had lost 27 million people. They had defeated 200 German divisions. When America enters the war at Normandy, because that's really when they started to play for keeps, the war was already won because there were only 10 German divisions that they had to face. And the Russians would have taken them out had they not gone against them themselves. But to watch the movies, you would think America won World War II. So who wins? The one who defeated 200 divisions or the one that defeated 10? It's pretty obvious. Now, towards the end of World War II, Stalin and Russia established a relationship. Stalin realizes that the American power is far greater than his. And so there are a number of agreements and concessions that Roosevelt wrests from Stalin. One of them is that Stalin not support Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong led the Chinese Communist Party and would eventually be victorious and rule China. But at this point, he was leading the Chinese Communist Party. And Roosevelt called for Stalin to support Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang Kai-shek was a ruthless dictator, a gangster. And he did. And Mao was forced into an alliance with Chiang Kai-shek, which eventually would lead to the Long March, death of a lot of Chinese. So this was a concession that Stalin was willing to make. He also asked Stalin to neutralize the left in France so that they would not push for socialism in France. And he did. He did the same thing in Greece. Stalin, in fact, went to forces in Greece and told them, you don't want to go up against the United States with all their power, blah, blah, blah. He was perfectly satisfied to be in a relationship with the United States. Now, Stalin was no good. He killed almost as many people as the Germans did. So I don't think I got any love for Stalin. But the point is, he recognized his position in the world order and expected to get aid from the U.S. to be rebuilt since they had saved the West. So, and also, Roosevelt and Stalin had an agreement to be the two major forces in the United Nations. Now, the United Nations ended up having a Security Council. This was an idea broached first by Roosevelt to Churchill in the early period of World War II. Churchill went along with it, but he didn't like it because he didn't like the idea of a United Nations with the Russians in it, but especially the Chinese. He was a racist, and hated Russia. Most of the West has hated Russia. But he went along with it because under Aryanism, you have to bow to the Lord and Master. That's what happens. You know what I mean? So prior to Roosevelt's death, Stalin and Roosevelt had worked out an agreement that they would play a major role in the United Nations, cooperating with each other. Stalin was prepared to do that. Now, when Roosevelt dies, who's left? Truman. They like to call him the accidental president because while Roosevelt had refused to run for office at one point unless a man named Henry Agard Wallace was made his 33rd vice president of the United States, his vice president, he would not stand for nomination for the Democratic Party. That's how strong he was for Wallace. Wallace was a progressive, to say the very least. He had been Secretary of Agriculture, the 11th, Secretary of Congress, the 10th of Commerce. He was close to Booker T. Washington. He was a great agriculturalist and a great humanist, and stood for not only anti-racism, but anti-imperialism. And so when Truman assumes office, he's looking down the road. He's looking at what's his chances for being elected on his own president. And standing in his way is Wallace. Wallace has more support in the Democratic Party than he has. And so part of Truman's decisions around what he's going to do has to do with putting himself in a position where he has a chance to become president in his own right. And he is going to have to create his own version of the Democratic Party. Now, Truman had come from a group called the Pendergrass Crime Machine in Kansas, Missouri. He was such a non-entity that Pendergrass had said that he picked Truman to prove that he could put anybody in as senator. Unfortunately for Pendergrass, Roosevelt found him as an embarrassment and put him in prison so that he could have a more respectable run in controlling politics in Kansas, Missouri, where Truman was from. So Truman knew hardly nothing when he assumed the office of presidency. He knew nothing about the atom bomb project. He didn't know anything. I mean, they barely met, Roosevelt and him. And Roosevelt went along with his selection because he was on the verge of dying, man. He didn't have the energy to push for much of anything. And so he's listening to advisors. Truman is. Truman had a high school education, no college. Now, that's not a bad thing if you're well read. And I read the biographies on Truman, and they're pure fiction because they create the impression, the myth, that Truman was self-educated, that he read a lot. Because if he did, that would be fine. That might be better than one of these miseducations you're going to get at the Ivy League or somewhere else. But it turns out that Truman only started reading in his 80s. He'd fall asleep in cabinet meetings. This is according to Gore Vidal, who pretty well informed on the power elite since he came from it and on foreign policy defected from it. So he was not only an accidental president, but didn't know too much as a president. And so he's being told by advisors something that isn't true. You can't trust the Russians. The Russians won't follow through on their agreement, which isn't true. They followed through on their agreements. It was America that waited to intervene when Russia had won the war, because Roosevelt's policy was to shed as little American blood in World War II as possible. That was his policy. So one of the people that Truman listens to is a businessman and politician. And be clear about this, the policies that Truman carries out, and I really want to say this in the very beginning, this is an underestimated president. There have been presidents who have shifted the whole nature of American policy, and there have been very few of them. Roosevelt, in part because of the New Deal and World War II. Lincoln, because of him being pushed in the position where he has to issue an Emancipation Proclamation that changes the status of Africans as enslaved people. Truman, and then Ronald Reagan. Two of these had very little going for them. Reagan was a cipher, someone that just didn't know what was going on at all. But he shifted the presidency to bring poverty back and a whole lot of other things. I'll get into this one next week. But the policies that Truman would carry out would shift the whole nature of American foreign policy in the world and the whole nature of how this country operated internally. And so, whatever you want to say about how smart or dumb he was a consequential president. And the way in which he was a consequential president is ignored by his biographers because they are there not to discuss what he really did. So he's listening to an advisor like Charles E. Wilson. Notice I always give you facts. In 1944, Charles Wilson, who was both a businessman and a politician, said this, quote, "Instead of looking to disarmament and unpreparedness as a safeguard against war, a thoroughly discredited doctrine, let us try the opposite, full preparedness according to a continuing plan." Truman took this advice and similar advice coming from other business people and politicians, but especially business people, because Truman's policies were so thoroughgoing that for a know-nothing president, you cannot attribute this solely to him. You have to look for the people who were advising him. And these are the people that run the country, the corporate elite. Quit saying white people run the country. There's an elite that runs the country. You hear me? And he was listening to them. This corporate elite had been heavily enriched by a war in which prior to World War II, they had supported Hitler. And as I note from one of the observations previously, Hitler's Third Reich was based on the U.S. It was based on the genocide of Native Americans, the reservation policies and ghetto policies against Blacks and Native Americans, and the whole way in which lobotomies and stuff were performed on people. All of this, Hitler based his Third Reich on. And he said so in Mein Kampf, you know. So the picture of World War II is the good against the bad is really stretching stuff, really stretching stuff. These are birds of a feather. They just had a fight over who would rule the roost. So Truman makes the decision to go for a policy that would put America on a war footing, a permanent war footing. And this is what makes him a consequential president. But his problem was this: how could you convince the American people that the Russians, who were no military threat or economic threat to the U.S., were? Now, here's the deal. He didn't even try and convince Europe. He couldn't tell Europe that the Russians are coming. The Russians are a threat. The Russians broke the back of who was coming, the Germans. They broke their back. And they also knew they were flat on their back then. More dead than anything else, you know? No threat to them at all. And say, I'm not pro-Russian. I'm just stating facts here. So how was he going to be able to convince the American people? And see, this war in Ukraine is an extension of what he was able to do then, you know? He couldn't do this without the support of the Republican Party. If the Republican Party opposed him on this, they could simply put the facts out there. And the media and everything else would have trouble going against it because they're the party of big business, as are the Democrats. They both dance to the music of the elite. So the Republicans went along with it. Dewey, who would become Truman's opponent in the upcoming elections, Truman gets Dewey to go along with it, and the major leaders of the Republican Party, they're signing their own death warrant. because that's what's going to enable Truman to get reelected. Now, this is the key point here, that American imperialism has been heavily affected by party fortunes. The intrusion into the Philippines and other things had to do with maintaining party strength in 1898, especially the Democrats. So what you have to understand is part of Truman's motive was getting reelected. It had nothing to do with American national interest. That's a number one. But number two, he is listening to those who run the country, and they are defining the national interest. Remember, last week I made the point, when they say national interest, you need to ask whose interest, because they're making it look like it's the country. You know what I mean? When he's getting advice that's saying that permanent preparedness for war has been proven to be a good thing, by who? You know what I mean? This is pure fabrication. Since when has building up a military economy proved to be the best way forward? So Truman is operating on this advice, and I must say, one of the real concerns of the ruling class in this country was that America could slip back into a depression if it went back on a purely civilian economy. This was their fear, because it was World War II that took America out of the Depression. It was not the New Deal. And that was true also in Germany. It was preparation for war that built up the German economy. So there was that fear. It wasn't that they feared that people be unemployed and hurt. They feared that the government might be overthrown. So that was a secondary reason. But the main reason was that if you shift the economy to a war economy, this is going to benefit big business in big ways, but it's going to hurt everybody else. So a Republican senator named Arthur Vandenberg met with Truman. Now, this is the other party telling him how to sell this war doctrine. He tells him, if you want to put America on a war footing, if you want to get the budgetary approval from Congress that you need to hike up the military budget, then what you're going to have to do, and I'm quoting from Vandenberg. Notice I quote, you're going to have to scare the hell out of the American people, end of quote. Huh? That's really not hard when you've bred a people on fear. And again, the Lord and Master syndrome. On the one hand, the Lord and Masters who treat the people with contempt, all they have to do is lie enough and then get enough of the press and both political parties to go along with it. And I've noticed when I'm outside this country, it's like it's a propaganda vacuum. You can go to other countries and get all kinds of information. You go to Africa, Africans are well informed on politics. The Caribbean, everybody's debating politics. Even in Europe, in this country, it's a propaganda vacuum. And unless you have alternative sources of information, you'll be fooled. And it didn't take too much to fool people. So starting with October 23rd, 1947, Truman started delivering Red Scare speeches. That is, the commies are coming. The communists are going to do you in. By saying that the French and the Italians were threatened by the Russians. Pure bull. It is true. The Russians posed a threat to Poland, to Eastern Europe. These had been the places where invasions had been launched against, particularly Poland, against Russia. And they had been, at that point, conquered by Germany. And what's also true that is normally missed is See, when I started apprenticing under John Henry Clark, I mentioned this before when I was showing you the library here. John told me to read the 6 volumes of Churchill on World War II. Well, in one of those volumes, Churchill goes to meet with Stalin. This is towards the end of World War II. And they reach an agreement that Stalin could have Poland. And this agreement was reached on a napkin. And when Churchill is leaving his meeting with Stalin, Churchill says, what should I do with the napkin? Stalin said, keep it. The Americans under Roosevelt had also agreed that this was a Russian sphere of influence. You know, it's like their lake. So this whole concern about the Russians are coming, the only valid concern would be over Eastern Europe. And the fact is that the U.S. and Britain had no concern for protecting Eastern Europe from Russia. And that was the only threat that Russia posed. And that was not a threat of full-scale occupation of Eastern Europe. Russia's finances, military forces, their power was sapped. It's only when Truman begins to pursue his Cold War policies that the Russians then have to do Russification in these Eastern European countries. They didn't have to happen. He would have kept them under a leash, but it would have been a longer leash. But once Truman does his number, then he causes the problems, you know. So he delivers a series of Red Scare speeches, and then he gets help from the arch-imperialist Winston Churchill, who came to the United States and delivered his famous address, because he was quite a good speaker. An iron curtain is descending on Europe. Here is the man who was the arch-imperialist, the arch-hater, you know what I mean, who said he didn't fight World War II to end the British Empire, but it did end it. It sapped you of all your strength, and you had the Americans picking the gold teeth out of your mouth, which means, as I pointed out last week, going to the gold reserves of South Africa that belonged to Britain and storing them in ships and going away until they got some friendly lend-lease, that is, military equipment given for free. Of course, it really wasn't free. I mean, America was getting other people to fight a war that they weren't yet prepared to fight, you know. So American public was lied to. They were told that the Russians were a threat when they were not. They were a threat to Europe and a threat to the world when they were flat on their knees and never had the power to be that kind of threat anywhere. So instead of pursuing disarmament and peace and economic prosperity for the rich and enough for everybody else, Truman, from day one of his presidency, chose to tear up all the agreements that Roosevelt had reached with Russia, to tear up the post-World War II order that he had planned to put into effect, and to put in its place, and this is where Truman plays the role of the consequential president that shifts policy, in fact, carries out a coup d'etat, as one of our leading scholars, Gore Vidal, says, a coup d'etat against the United States, to establishing the national security state. And he does this through the National Security Act of 1947 that wasn't put into effect until 1950 and was not revealed to the American people until it was declassified in 1975. So the American people didn't know anything about NSC 68, National Security Council Act 1968. This created the national security state. That is a state that is based on a war footing when there are no enemies to fight. And by the way, Truman was very careful not to do anything to engage Russia in open armed conflict, because if he did that, the whole house would have come down on his head. So he was really creating a mythical Cold War. Mythical, because there ain't no war to it, except with your mouth and with the myth that the Russians are coming. The boogeyman is coming, who ain't coming nowhere. You know what I mean? So what were the key provisions of National Security Council Order 1968? First, never to negotiate with Russia. That was the first one. Now, they couldn't sustain that forever, but as long as they could, and as long as they had the propaganda backing their moves, they could create this myth that the Russians are coming. Only to the U.S. Ain't nobody else in Europe fell for this. The second policy was develop the hydrogen bomb. You had already developed the atom bomb, and Stalin had his spies all over it. And in a couple of years, he had the atom bomb. So they wanted the hydrogen bomb so that when the Russians finally developed an atom bomb, we would still have something to hold over their head. Third, rapidly build up conventional forces. What this meant was America went on the draft. Here is World War II is over. No enemy in sight. The whole world almost is flattened. That is, of Europe, Asia, particularly China, has been heavily hit by World War II, and Japan hit beyond measure, Philippines, other places. And so there's nothing to stand up to America. But you're going to put in effect a draft, building up conventional forces. For what? Imperialism. Fourth, put through a large increase in taxes to pay for this. Until Reagan, on the rich, you had a 90% tax. Now, I used to say that's okay. I mean, I'm for the rich paying as much as possible. But paying for a war machine, give me a break. And of course, it's the working class, and as some people have pointed out, there's no middle class left in this country now that would be paying for this. Fifth, this is the real biggie. Mobilize the brainwashed American public. And here we're talking about the white public. The Aryans, the despised ones, mobilize them against the specter of the rise of communism. There's a communist coming in your bedroom. I pointed out this before, where I live, right on the corner. It's a Chinese American built him a big 5,000 square foot house. He's got a bomb shelter inside of it. They scared him so much that he was ready to drop into a bomb shelter. You should know common sense. When one nation has that bomb and two nations have it, ain't neither one yet used it against the other. I'm not saying it'll never happen, but it'd be stupid if it does. You know what I mean? And American had more, but it doesn't matter. You got one, you got enough. You know what I mean? So this was the set of policies. And then through this, a sixth policy creating a strong alliance system centered on NATO. And then there would be subsequent spinoffs of NATO, SEATO, S-E-A-T-O, Southeast Asian Treaty Organization. And then wage propaganda war against the Russians by getting the people to turn against the government. And the key thing of all of this was this: engage Russia in an arms race to break Russia's back. Now, this was Russia's mistake to fall for that. Chinese haven't fallen for that. They're incrementally building up their military while they put their main emphasis on building up their civilian economy and becoming an economic powerhouse, now the second in the world. displacing American power all over the world economically without firing a shot. So these are the policies that was put into effect by creating the national security state. And what this meant is that you would have a permanent war economy. What this meant is that the bulk of money that the federal government would spend would go for defense. Let me give you some examples. And note, Democrats and Republicans agree on this to this day. So this isn't just Truman's policy. This policy goes on to this minute. Now, one of the ways in which they hide how serious the national security state is and the defense budget is that they, and the media has gone along with this, is they treat Social Security as an entitlement. And so since the expenditures on Social Security are fairly large, for 2022, $1.37 trillion. There's just one problem. You pay for Social Security, but treating it as an entitlement is treating it as an expense that the government is spending. And so every time they got a problem, they're talking about cutting social programs. And the main one is Social Security that you paid for. One of the last gains of the New Deal that's still in effect. And if you ever get the Republicans in charge of the presidency, the House, and the Senate, you will see the end of Social Security. And for all the people that say, oh, they can't do it because I paid into it, you're operating on the moral principle that people do right. You live in the real world, please. You hear me? They've taken everything else. This is the only last thing they can take other than your life. You know what I mean? So building the national security state meant putting most of the resources into the defense budget, which is $722 billion. Now, the overall defense budget, because it's not just military spending, but all the backup for military spending, is over $1 trillion. Over $1 trillion. And then America paying for a lot of wars on credit. So the Chinese, they owe the Chinese. And in the 70s, they were owing the Japanese, who were, buying up treasury notes and stuff like that. So the key point is that with the decision to do the national security state, the decision is made to put America on a permanent war footing and to disinvest in the people. And so why do you have rundown roads, potholes sometimes big enough to almost take a car? Why do you have bridges that are collapsing? Why do you have very little put into the public schools, especially the schools of the poor and people of color? Why do you have no health care that is meaningful? Obama did something, but it's nothing. The rest of the Western world has New Dealism, but they added more. They added health care. But basically, the social programs that you find in Sweden, Great Britain, France, Germany, that's the New Deal. And with Reagan, they began to knock that one out. So what you have to understand is American imperialism is centered around the national security state, around the military buildup, and around those 7 points of NSC 68 that put this country on this war footing. Now, what most American people don't understand is this, that when Truman makes the decision to overturn Roosevelt's policies, and by the way, I'm not suggesting that had Roosevelt remained as president, America wouldn't have been an imperialist power. I'm suggesting it would have been a different kind of imperialism, unless he made the move to do a national security state. It would have been a different kind of imperialism, because the nature of the international bodies they were set up were designed for American neo-colonial economic control, But by tearing those up, this meant American intervention. And that's what Henry Wallace basically said. He said when Truman started to intervene in the Greek Civil War, he said, what America is intent on doing under the Truman Doctrine is to treat any crisis in the world as one that America has a right to intervene in. And what would that mean? America overthrowing the government in Guatemala and torturing thousands of people. Overthrowing the government of Patrice Lumumba, killing him. And that was on the orders of the CIA, coming directly from Eisenhower. Eisenhower made the decision and made the statement in the presence of his CIA head. He said, that man has insulted my friend, King Leopold, or, the king of Belgium, that he had insulted him. And that, the head of the CIA said, he translated that to mean as a executive order for assassination. And when in comes Kennedy, it is Kwame Nkrumah who appeals to him to save Patrice Lumumba's life. And his answer is, well, I'm for the stability of the Congo. That's a lie. It's for the instability of the Congo, because the Congo's got the largest supply of mineral resources of any country in the world, other than maybe Russia. And so the last thing the West wanted was a leader in there who's looking out for the welfare of its people. So imperialism meant going after anyone that stands in the way of American power. And that doesn't mean that these people are doing anything wrong. It's just that they're looking out for the welfare of their own people. They just don't want to be subordinate to someone else. The national security state would also mean that America would begin to engage in war, because if you're going to build up a military economy, you're going to have war. And so what's interesting, this is very interesting. Most people don't know this. When the campaign goes for Eisenhower to run for office, the Democratic candidate that challenges him is Adlai Stevenson. Adlai Stevenson had heavy Southern support, heavy racist support. Adlai Stevenson would take a position that the war that had occurred in Korea, and this is one of the first moves that is made under the national security state to engage in war, that is after World War II. So Truman intervenes in the Korean War. Now, this is a side point. This is a very important side point. I've always wondered why the Russians didn't attend the Security Council meetings where a decision was being made on whether or not the United Nations would support a police action by the United Nations, which would mean the U.S. and other troops intervening in a war between the North and the South in Korea. Why was it that the Russians didn't attend the Security Council meeting? I always wondered, because they had a veto. And it was in their interest to see that North Korea, which was their ally, be protected. I did some research, and the research showed, and in 2011, my wife and I went to China. It was a honeymoon, and China is one of my specialties. So the guides were experts on Chinese history. They couldn't get jobs in the university. They had degrees in history, Chinese history, but they couldn't get jobs, so they were making money as tour guides. They made more probably than professors did. So I told them that according to my research, because there's certain books they don't get in China, I said, according to my research, Mao had been trying to get the secrets for the atom bomb from Stalin. Stalin wouldn't give it up. But then Stalin approached Mao and told him he wanted to give America a bloody nose because of this whole Cold War stuff that America had run on him. And so he offered to give China the atom bomb, the secrets to the atom bomb, on condition that they render the bloody nose to the United States. And what was that bloody nose? When MacArthur crossed the 38th parallel, he had been warned not to do it by Mao. Mao Zedong, the head of China, said, if you do it, I'm intervening. And he did. And waves of Chinese troops, along with North Vietnamese, ran the American Marine Corps and Army right out of North Vietnam. This was America's first defeat. In terms of the decline of the U.S., this is the beginning of its decline. But it was to inflict a bloody nose. Bloody nose means he wasn't going for war against America. And of course, his hands weren't in it. You couldn't say the Russians did this. And the Chinese had perfectly good reason for doing this. By the way, Truman backing this put him in the position where he couldn't run for a second term because his butt had been whipped by the Chinese and the North Koreans. Of course, some people would say this is not a defeat. It's a half a defeat, like hell. If you're on the street and you got a little gang and someone chases you off the street, you got whipped. You ran away. You know, and beat you up while you're running. That's what happened. You know what I mean? And my first wife's brothers, they were in Korea. Some of them were stationed with MacArthur, and they said they thought he went off. Off or not, this was what really happened. So America, under the National Security Council state, under a Democratic president, had made a decision to intervene in an internal conflict between, you know, two rivals. Call it a civil war if you want to, North and South, right? Going back to Stevenson. So Stevenson is running against Eisenhower. He ain't got a ghost of a chance of beating him. Because if you led the military in this country, then you can get elected to almost anything. You know what I mean? As long as it was victorious, even if you didn't win, but you thought you won. So what does Stevenson say his policy would be? Because when Eisenhower is elected, Eisenhower pursues this policy. His policy was, he lets the national security state exist, but then when he leaves office, he warns you of the military-industrial complex. He really wanted to warn the American people of the military-industrial political complex, but he was persuaded to leave the political out because it would not be political. Because he'd offend his own party because the Republicans were a part of this. So he left that out because they were all in collusion on this. So the thing is, here is Eisenhower, who comes into office, and what Eisenhower does is he says, he ain't going to do what Truman did. He's going to let the Asians fight the Asians. And he uses the threat of nuclear blackmail, that is, dropping nukes on people, as the only thing he's going to do. So actually, he didn't really engage in outright war. He was engaged in overthrowing governments and stuff like that. You know what I mean? But when Stevenson runs for office in the first campaign against Eisenhower, he says he would use Asians to bring in Americans, or he would use Americans to just intervene in Asian affairs. In other words, he would do what Truman ended up doing. And that becomes the policy of the succeeding Democratic administrations, Kennedy and Johnson. And there's a whole lot of stories about how Kennedy was going to withdraw troops from Vietnam and all the rest of that, but he put over 10,000 in, and Johnson went for the full buildup, and Johnson didn't have an Ivy League education. And that meant Johnson had more understanding of what was really going on. Johnson never thought he could win. His Secretary of Defense did for a while, because they were all Kennedy holdovers, but Johnson never did. But Johnson didn't want to be seen as someone who gave up Vietnam to the commies. This anti-communism thing had been so strong that it spooked a whole lot of people. And so he killed his own presidency, and of course, killed his chance for winning a second term, and killed his chance for going down as one of the 3 or 4 best presidents the U.S. had, based on all the legislation he got passed. So the national security state is the real reason why America ends up going into decline, because imperialism being the last phase of great powers, once you go into this stage, you enter it, and then you engage in war after war, and every one of those wars you lose. America's only won a war in Grenada. That was their great military defeat. A handful of other small ones, but they've won nothing. They won nothing of consequence. Manuel Noriega was overthrown. You know what I mean? That was the extent of their military successes. And so you see in Vietnam, what's interesting is Kennedy, before he becomes president, had gone through Southeast Asia. And when his father was ambassador in England, he was a right-winger, he had written a paper for Harvard. Quite, brilliant paper. And he concluded that the French could not win in Vietnam. Yet he's sticking troops into Vietnam. Now, his advisors, but a substantial number. James Bond was his favorite author. He would actually go to military training exercises where the military would put on these false shows where they would have soldiers who had rockets on their back and flying for a few feet. This stuff that didn't even work. You know what I mean? So he wanted to prove that you could stop national liberation movements. Well, what Vietnam proved was you can't. Because you see, this second feature had fallen in. That was a shift in mindset. And the Vietnamese had acquired the techniques, that is, the technical military gunpowder. And the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, which had been planned in the Pentagon, was the defeat of the French in Vietnam. And if a strategy concocted through the French with American support, approval, and planning would not work, what makes you think that direct American intervention is going to work? So pursuing this this Stevenson doctrine, you have the intervention of the United States in Vietnam. And so by 1972, the United States has lost in Vietnam. And so you can trace the beginning of the real military decline from 1945 to 1972. 27 years that America held global power and went into decline because of the way in which they handled it. This is the most rapid decline of a military power, of an imperialist power in human history. You had to be pretty dumb to pull this off. You hear me? Those of you who identify with America are sad about this. I'm not, So what we see is that through concentrating on the national security state and implementing these policies, America then found itself pulled into the war in Afghanistan, which I saw that war immediately. I know some of you that watch this show really think that that was a false flag operation. The U.S. did that. I know a lot of people that think that. One Congresswoman McKinney, lost her position in Congress for arguing that. And I could say there'd be some reasons to assume that, because America is capable of doing something like that if they want to have a reason for rallying people around some objective. And certainly after the fall of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the U.S. didn't need a new enemy. And it became the so-called terrorists, largely the Arabs, But I saw that. I was in class when that attack took place. I'm a strategist. I knew exactly what that was. I have a term for it. It was a crown jewel strategy. I didn't know exactly who did it then, but it wasn't hard to figure out later. They said they did it. It was bin Laden. He did it. And what was the purpose? To drag America into a quagmire. What was that quagmire? Afghanistan. And when George Bush, who was another know-nothing president, his first term, his vice president ran the White House, Cheney, When he asked for plans from the Defense Department for intervening in Afghanistan, they had no plan. They have a plan for a war on the moon. Why wouldn't they have a plan for Afghanistan? Because they didn't think any leader would be stupid enough to go in there. That's why. So they used a CIA plan, which was really the only thing America had, which was to use operatives and stuff and align with various forces inside of Afghanistan, but not do a full-scale war and go after bin Laden. I'm not justifying it. I'm not saying they should have. I'm saying strategically, that was their option. Now, bin Laden, in his wildest dreams, never believed that America would be dumb enough to go into Iraq. And by the way, I've read some stuff from the Council on Foreign Relations where some of their advisors recommended going into Iraq. I'm not saying that was their policy. I'm saying that prior to that invasion, they had some of their thinkers saying they should actually do it. Why? Because they wanted to get the oil. But they already had the oil. That wasn't the issue. They had access to the oil. And America's not oil dependent anyway. So the point is, discussion today is Aryanism, the philosophy that inspired the decline of the West and U.S. imperialism. The very thing that sparked the rise of American power is what's brought America down. The very things that they did to take this country, the very things that they did in the early period, 1898 on, to fill in the vacuum that was held by the Spanish taking their colonies. The very thing that enabled them to rise to power was the very thing that's brought them down. And it's the national security state. And it's the over-reliance on the military and a military budget for objectives that make no sense to begin with. They're not only wrong, they're stupid. What strategic objectives did you have in Afghanistan? And by the way, after these wars are over, it's the Chinese who are in there signing agreements right now in Afghanistan. The first ones to sign agreements in Iraq, the Chinese. I call that smart. They call it win-win without shedding any blood. So the national security state lasted for 27 years as any kind of enterprise. It's still there, but it's weakened. They have drained the military resources of their infantry. Their infantry has been put in a position of fighting so many conflicts. Some soldiers have been in battle conditions 6 and 7 times, that they've been driven nuts, literally. For what? You know? And then we've seen the decline of the U.S. in every other way. And then what we'll get into next week, the decision to export the technology abroad and what that has done to this country. So the creation of a military industrial complex dictates war. And because of the way America's handled it, losing wars, including the one you're seeing going on right now in Ukraine, one that could have been avoided. Had America wanted to, they could have advised them not to engage in this. So the shift in consciousness of the mind of Africans in the U.S., of Africans globally, the shift in consciousness of the minds of people in Asia, the shift in consciousness mirrored in the Cuban Revolution and among the masses of people in Latin America or South America, is a shift in consciousness that says, hell no, we're not taking this anymore. And so as America declines, we see in the United States the rise of people of color, black, brown, red, and yellow. That's part of what this victory in Georgia portends. Partially what the population of the largest population of a state in the United States, California, portends, which is a majority people of color. So now you have a shift in power dynamics numerically, and a shift of power dynamics economically, politically, and probably militarily, as America enters a period of decline, and you see the rise of China, and eventually the rise of Africa, and the need to transform this country from crooked to straight, from unjust to just. So these are conditions that we need to look at, that we need to appreciate. So freeing your mind is a key part of freeing everything else. And these sixfold stages to mental freedom, this system that we'll be setting up as soon as we have 40, is a part of that process. Rebuilding our families and communities is a part of that. And Africa being able to free itself from indirect outside control, the Caribbean as well, and other parts of the world. So this concludes this presentation on Aryanism, the philosophy that inspired the decline of the West and U.S. imperialism. Hotep. Thai 313. I talked about the Korean War as much as I'll talk about here. Basically, that America got whipped. The North Koreans and the Chinese ran them out of North Korea. That was America's first defeat. I'm not going into all the details of the war, but I'm simply saying that the national security state created by Truman and followed by every president, Democrat and Republican since then, and each president fighting to increase the military budget, that includes Biden, has dictated these outcomes, So, the Korean War was that. Lao Tzu, the Japanese had guns during the same period as the European, yet they did not pursue the use of guns in warfare. Why is that? Well, in the early period where the samurai, code and the Bushido code, Bushido, the code of the samurai, which is basically that when you enter war, you accept the fact that you're going to die. And you also follow your overlords, into battle. So there was no need for them to have a military based exclusively on gunpowder because no one else they were dealing with did, and they couldn't because they had not industrialized. It's when they industrialize that they can then put their army on a permanent modernization footing where guns are the central force in a military. Ty 313, Africans had to prepare for competition with any other group, not just white folks. Yeah, that's true. Guns were dishonorable to Asian culture at first. Well, I don't know about that. The Chinese had perfected the use of gunpowder with cannon. So if you're using gunpowder with cannon, you're ready to use it because that's the big military weapon. In fact, Napoleon, who was the best ground commander in the 19th century in Europe, he was a artillery commander at first because that's where the heavy firepower was, you know. So yeah, I think with the warrior codes of Africa, of Asia, of various parts of the world, shooting somebody long distance and killing a whole lot of people, that wasn't really the objective of warfare to begin with. But once your enemy has that, you have no choice, you know. Tashaka, question. Just because China is rising, does that mean that Africa will rise? No, not just because China is rising. No, because of the conditions that exist in China, in Africa, the culture of African people, the huge numerical predominance that Africans are gaining, over 1 billion people. The resources that we have on that continent, once we can create governments that serve the people and at some point strive for continental unity. That's hard. But if we can achieve that, then that will be the key to our power. So that's going to be hard. Nothing's automatic in history. And I think that there are preconditions, if you study world history, that would indicate what the preconditions are for Africa's rise. And with the decline of the West, those preconditions are beginning to happen, you know. Thanks, Robin. Robin, savage thirst for power made them blind. That's very true. Yeah, Ty 313, the U.S. funded bin Laden, really the CIA, to get the Russians out of Afghanistan. That's true. And in fact, some of the first people after 9/11 that were ushered out of the country were Saudis who may have had something to do with this. You know what I mean? But they were ushered out of the country right away. Brother Ugawa, what type of international order was FDR planning on creating if he hadn't died or been able to keep Wallace as his vice president? Well, first of all, you didn't have Wallace at that point. The international order that I described last week, the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, World Court, United Nations, all of which were under American control. And it didn't mean that they had to have the majority of people in there making the decisions. Their allies were doing that for them. So that clearly was a part of it. Would he have gone further? We don't know. But the policies that he was implementing up to that point was not in that direction. Something else I should point out, and this is something that will be hard for some people to digest, but do the math. So, if Truman's objective, which he carried out, was to arm the Germans and to create NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, when the Russians were really no threat. So it really wasn't created to protect anybody from the Russians. So what was it created for? Think about it. This is some good common sense. It was created to control Europe. It was put on the ground to keep Europe in check. Pure and simple. Why would I reach that conclusion? It's the only thing it could do. And it was planted on German soil first. But note the people that he's arming, these are ex-Nazis, basically. All right? So what does that say? And then the question is, in the beginning, why was the CIA created? We know in the end, to maintain their global order, to do mischief. But in the beginning, to keep Western Europe in check. That's why. I mean, it's the only other reason. I mean, they didn't need it for anything else in the beginning. The rest of the world was flat on its back. Think about it. Best thing they could do is disband NATO right now. And that's one of the main reasons why this war that's going on now with the Russians is going on. The promise that this country could be brought into NATO and be brought in the European Union when they don't want them in there, you know? Coco, what's your thoughts on Chinese business in Africa? Many people associate it with imperialism, but wouldn't these relationships be important to build resistance against fascist imperialism? Yeah, that's an interesting one. And in the case of the Chinese presence in Africa, you got the same question in Latin America. The same, the Chinese have displaced as the number one trading partner. They are the number one trading partner with Brazil. They displaced the United States. They're the number one trading partner with Germany. And Germany is the strongest economy in Europe. They did not deindustrialize. They did not ship all their businesses off to Asia. So they're all over the world becoming a dominant power. So in the case of Chinese business in Africa, the Chinese are going after resources. And so Africa's resource rich. So one of the things they're doing is doing building structures and stuff. They're also making loans. But they're doing buildings. They're building roads. They're building structures of various kinds. And in some cases, Africa, Asia, different places where they've made loans, some of these borrowers are in trouble because they're not able to pay right now. Due to inflation, due to the downturn in economies. So some of them are put in positions where they're not able to pay. So there's that problem. And then there's a problem of what the Chinese want in return for debts not paid. So that's a problem. But here's the opportunity for China. So it was the same thing when the U.S. deindustrialized. So they put resources into China to take care of, to use their cheap labor to make money. But what did the Chinese do? They turned that around to build up their own industrial infrastructure. It was a part of Deng Xiaoping's policy of modernization. He was lucky that the West was dumb enough to do this, you know? And they thought that because again, they underestimated people of color. They thought that state-operated capitalism wouldn't work. They thought it wouldn't work because it didn't work in Russia. It definitely didn't work in Russia. So they figured it wouldn't work. They didn't understand there's a thing called Confucianism with the Chinese. So they have an idea of order And a few people can be in charge and others will bow to them if their interests are met. So I think that the one opportunity that Africa gets out of this is that they have access to some capital and not under the stringent rules that the U.S. and the IMF and World Bank impose. And so if you have honest governments, they would use those resources for the building of Africa, just as the Chinese used Western resources for building up their own countries. So I think it's a question of what you do to benefit the people. But as long as you have neo-colonial governments, where even when growth occurs in the African economy, it doesn't filter down into better style of living for the people, because the growth is going into the pockets of a few. So I think that that's a part of that, you know. Tide 13, look into the Chinese loans, and if African countries can pay them back, or the terms of the loan, such as if you default, we will own a specific resource in your country like gold. Yeah, good question. You know. Should it be understood that a unified Africa wouldn't need Chinese to support building infrastructure? Yeah, I mean, Africa has a lot of skills, and the African in America has the largest skill bank of any group of Africans in the world. And you can use us to help out with that. But the key thing is, no, you shouldn't need China to build infrastructure. If you have a unified Africa and you're drawing from the economic strengths of Africa and you're doing intertrade between Africans, then building infrastructure is simple. You know, it's really seeing that wealth is distributed in a way that benefits the people, not a very few. But that's the struggle, building a unified Africa. China unified in 221 BC. We've been a continent. That's not easy to unify a continent, but yeah, that can happen. Yeah, Coco, you're right on that. She's saying a unified Africa would need strong relationships with control over resources. That's correct. And we got to be careful. We don't give up so many resources, there are none left, you know? James Pooh, isn't the disbanding of NATO without replacing the Aryan might makes right paradigm premature, and since via Aryanism might is inherently good, what would persuade the mighty to disarm? Yeah, true. I'm not saying it's going to happen. I'm saying it should happen. That's all. And I'm also saying it's not in the interest of Europe. I mean, you know, Europe has been put, see, what happens with the national security state of the US is that it forced Europe to go into being many national security states, MINI, not just MANY, MINI. So that while you have social services being delivered by these states are also owned and controlled by the very few as they are here. And they also have, many of them, a significant percentage of money being put into military budgets. If they're in NATO, that's a requirement. And even though these countries in Western Europe are putting more resources into caring for their people, they're less than they would be if they didn't have these small, mini European national security states. For what? You know? To intervene in wars that America fights that's not in Europe, that has nothing to do with Europe's interests, you know? Huh? Sun Temple talks about Vice President Cheney shooting his friend on a hunting trip and getting away with it. That's the key point there. Gregory James, No Worries, No Cry. I think that's a popular song. Okay, that looks like it. But here's a key point that I didn't point out. I should make this point. You should ask the question of, so what effect did the national security state have on blacks? And what effect did the national security state have on the freedoms of people in this country? The Red Scare followed right along with the national security state. So along with the national security state, you then have the creation within the national security state of various war-making policies that this country could carry out, but a clamp down inside the country. So one of the things that the rulers like is that when you have a common external enemy, it justifies clamping down on people inside the country. And so we know with the Red Scare in the early period after World War II, that was the House Un-American Activities Committee. That was charging people with being communists. And that was something that Truman let happen. They had other forces who were leading that, like Joseph McCarthy. That put people like W.B. Du Bois, Paul Robeson, and others under the gun and forced Du Bois to leave the country. But here's something that's not normally recognized. I'm going to leave you on this one. You ain't thought about this one. By creating this communist hysteria, this put limitations on what Black leadership actually considered in the Southern Black freedom movement. I've often said, well, the Southern Black freedom movement had to deal with voting rights and segregation as the first issues. They couldn't deal with anything else. But the more thought I've given to that, that doesn't make sense because, for example, Birmingham, which was King's best organized campaign, one of the lessons he learned from Albany, Georgia was that they didn't have any leverage in Albany, Georgia, meaning they didn't have any area where they could really hurt the power structure in their effort to desegregate. And so one of the lessons learned was that in Birmingham, they needed to have a strong economic arm in that campaign. And so their campaign called Operation Confrontation was supposed to deal with jobs, but its central focus was on desegregation, which was important. It got Civil Rights Bill. But the key point is the way in which the Red Scare was put down in this country, that anything that benefited the people was defined as communist. You understand? And so a jobs campaign could even be considered communist. Obviously, healthcare, communist, obviously investments in education coming from the federal government, communist. And so when Kennedy, when King concludes in 1965 that they now must move from civil rights to human rights, he defined human rights, a right to a job, a right to housing, education, healthcare, not included under the Constitution, that only granted civil rights, a right to free speech and so forth, free assembly and so forth. Now, he also called for a radical restructuring of the United States, which a part of that to him meant ending capitalism. So a struggle for jobs, a struggle for education, a struggle for healthcare isn't really revolutionary, but necessary. I've read nothing that shows where King and his people ever debated this or saw that they shouldn't engage in this kind of campaign for jobs and education and healthcare because it would be viewed as anti-communist. But I think that the whole Red Scare thing put a limit on how some people thought they could move at a certain time. And part of the proof of that is the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. When they first started organizing, they succumbed, and they never did it again, but they succumbed to pressure when they invited a Black person who was a communist to speak. They disinvited him. They never did that again. So that was a part of this Red Scare thing. And then King was being pressured to cut himself loose from advisors like Stanley Levinson, who was white, Jewish, and had been a member of the Communist Party. He did, but then reestablished relationships later on. So I'm saying that this idea of the Red Scare had some effect on how people thought and may have limited how they moved on certain issues. So if you think this had no effect on us, think again. Mama Neith, thank you. Brother Dreamchild, thanks for that reading list that I got sent to me. I'm going to be ordering some of those books on Aryanism and some other stuff. Gregory Jones, the Aryans are attempting to implement a minority rule apartheid state. I don't know if you're referring to the fact that some on the right would like to have a separate state that was just white in the U.S. That's interesting. Moving from controlling everything to just controlling a state or a few that's all white. That really indicates a mentality of dispossession. That's truly a defeatist mentality. Would I add Israel to that list? Israel is not Aryan, but Israel is oppressing the Palestinians. And the one thing they haven't done to them that the Germans did to the Jews is exterminate them. But they put them in hot boxes called the Gaza and the West Bank and put them on a calorie diet that averages about 1,400 calories a day. For most people, that's a starvation diet, and rating terror on them regularly while the U.S. continues to give them free military economic support. The best place to find my books is right here on this thing that you see under the screen. And you'll see there, I'll show you in a minute when it comes up. You order the books through there. I see it's not, I don't know why it's not listed there. But you order through Gumroad, over to Shaka, and go to Gumroad, and you can order my books, The Art of Leadership, Volume 1, The Integration Trap, Generation Gap Caused by a Choice Between Two Cultures, and Return to the African Mother Principle of Male and Female Equality. Okay. Gregory Jones. Israel is America's unsinkable aircraft carrier in hostile waters. Interesting. James Pooh. White vision is not dispossession. That's the sacred world of persons and families, communities, and nations. Like Wakanda. Oh, yes, it is. I studied the right wing. They have a mentality of dispossession. They believe that since they were rendered a defeat in the first, in the second Reconstruction, where blacks won the battle on restoring the right to vote and ending illegal Southern apartheid, they believe they were dispossessed. And Trump has that as a mentality. So study the right wing and you'll see that they're deeply infected by that. And in fact, a lot of their organizing, which is to counter us, we have black power, there's white power. Everyone is to come up with a term that's an extension of ours, is an extension of that dispossession. Yes, they do. They think they're entitled to rule this whole place, and they see that that's going down the tube. So that's their problem. So your question, Coco, I'll get this ad up here. It should have more to this brand than that. I'll have that put up the next time. Ty 313, did Dr. John Henry Clark ever talk to you about the mysterious deaths of black leaders like David Walker and Booker T. Washington? Listen to a lecture he left about a bit of it. No, but I mean, it's clear that he was murdered by whites, for David Walker's appeal, which was a call for blacks to rise up against slavery. Whether Booker T. Washington was actually killed, I don't know about that one. But no, we didn't talk about that. Yeah, you got that right. They got a losing mentality. And the more victories, see, every victory you score, just, note it. You don't have to brag or anything. It's not a matter of being arrogant. So there's nothing wrong with bragging. But the key thing is note it. And as Curtis Mayfield's song said, we're a winner. Note that. And when you go into battle, have a plan for winning. That's the whole point. It's to achieve justice on whatever level it is, but it's to win. That's the key thing. Not to lose. Lose a bad thing, especially when you're capable of winning. And the world is moving in our direction. Yes, they still have power here, but it's in decline. Take advantage of it. Build up your own power. And the first one is free your mind, Okay. The divine right to rule. Yeah, it's Aryanism. I went through that last week. Right on, Robin. You got that right, And the first thing you need to do is free your own mind, which means mind, body, and spirit. Control that. That's the first thing you need to control. And then that's the key to everything else, So I hope you all got something out of this. And we'll be on part 3, how this affects us and rebuilding our families, communities, and nations. Hotep.